after 32 years of marriage, he told me he had found someone younger. I smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile people expect after a bomb drops. It wasn't theatrical or defiant. It was a small, measured curve of the lip, the kind of smile that settles across your face when everything you thought you were disappears, and you discover with a strange clarity what remains. For a moment the world narrowed to the line of his mouth and the soft afternoon light on his hand as it rested on the table. Roberto looked at me as if he expected pleading, or a collapse, maybe a negotiation. He got neither. "She's 32, he said, as if the number itself explained the rest. "She's humble. She's young. It's not fair to hide this from you." There was a noise in the house somewhere, a distant clink of a spoon in the kitchen, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I let it out slowly. "Okay," I said. The word felt small, ridiculous, heavy, precise all at once. He waited. In those 32 years, I had learned to read him. The tilt of his head that meant diplomacy, the way he smoothed his napkin before saying something he wanted to sound casual. Tonight he tried for casual and landed on clumsy. "We should talk about how we do this," he added. "Logistics. The kids. They're adults," I interrupted. It was unnecessary to remind him, but the interruption steadied me. Gabriel and Amanda were both grown, living their own complicated lives, with jobs and partners and towns between us. I remembered the first time I had held each of them, the way their hair smelled like milk and soap, and the fierce, ridiculous certainty that I would protect them forever. Protecting them had meant choices. It had meant soft refusals and loud sacrifices. I had been ready for those. I had not been prepared for being set aside. He stood, the chair scraping. I watched the muscles in his jaw work like a man trying to swallow something bitter. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. "You didn't have to want it to do it," I replied. He blinked. He had expected surrender. He had not expected the list of things I spoke next, each one deliberate, as if I were cataloging the damage and naming it so it could no longer haunt me in the dark. "I'll be calling my lawyer. I want a separation. You can leave whenever you like," I told him. "But until then, you won't have access to our joint accounts." My voice surprised me, steady, practical. "Tomorrow morning I'll speak to our bank. For now, don't touch my office laptop." I said it not as punishment, but as containment. Not revenge. Containment. Roberto's face went through quick changes. Confusion, irritation, the faint flare of wounded dignity that always followed when his plans hit a wall. He tried sarcasm. He tried to make a joke that didn't land. In the end, he did the thing he always did when a room got too honest. He left. The house was the same in the half hour after he walked out. The cupboards, the framed photos on the mantel, the light coming through the blinds. They had not shifted. But the air felt different, sparser, as if some invisible furniture had been taken from the room, and I could feel the absence in the pattern of the light. I sat at the kitchen table, placed my palms flat on the wood, and let myself consider what had just happened with the merciless curiosity of someone inspecting a map after a storm. I smiled again. This time it was quieter, less a reaction and more a recognition. I realized with a sudden and crystallizing ache who I had been living for all these years. If this is hitting close to home for you, tell me where you're watching from. If you'd like more of these stories, please like and subscribe. Years earlier, the world seemed simpler. It is easy now to romanticize the meeting, how often narratives tidy themselves into heart-shaped vignettes, but our beginning was messy and ordinary in the most honest way. We met at a friend's small party in the mid-1980s. The music was too loud, the couch was too crowded, and I was wearing a dress that made me feel like a different person. Roberto came late, of course. He had that casual arrogance, arrived as if he were walking into the middle of a story he'd meant to write. We bickered about nothing for the whole evening, whether the host should have reheated the sauce, who drank the last glass of wine, whether the neighbor's cat had been on the roof. It was silly, and it was the kind of argument that plants roots. He proposed 3 months later in a living room, half full of boxes because we were moving into an apartment that would be ours. We were young and convinced that love would be constant, because we had not yet learned how much work it takes to keep two people together across ordinary days. Our children arrived, first Gabrielle and then Amanda, and with them love took on new shapes. Midnight feedings, school plays, scrapes and triumphs. I shifted. There was no other word. I had been an administrator at a small publishing house before Gabriel was born. I liked the rhythm of schedules and the hum of a printer in the morning. But the choice to step back felt natural then. Someone had to keep the house. Someone had to be present for the doctor visits and uniforms and teeth-brushing rituals. I told myself that work could wait, that ambition could be paused on a shelf like a rarely used cookbook. I would return to it when the children were older. I believed that, with the bright, deluded optimism of a mother making room for her family. I gave up promotions and late nights, and the idea of traveling for work. I gave up tertiary degrees and certain friends who suddenly felt far. In their place, I learned to keep track of soccer schedules and PTA meetings, to navigate a pediatrician's calm terrors, to become the fixer of scraped knees and broken hearts. I learned to say not tonight, and to make coffee that tasted the same whether we needed it or not. There were small rewards, too. We had dinners that smelled of tomato and garlic, straightforward, delicious. Sunday mornings with sleepy children and too much sunlight. The first home we bought, long before any secret investments, was a cramped triumph that felt like a fort. Those things mattered. They built a life. But alongside them, a quieter life was forming. The life I did not show Roberto. It started with an inheritance from my mother. She left me a modest sum, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines. My mother was practical. She always told me, keep a part of everything for yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. I tucked that money away, with the uneventful diligence of someone who had watched what insecurity feels like. I put a down payment on a small condo, not far from town. I told myself I would rent it out for extra income, the sort of neat financial safety net that felt adult and sensible. At first it was just one property, a quiet experiment. Then the rent came in, rents that were late, and then on time, and then reasonable. The tenants were good. I read pamphlets and went to a seminar about managing rentals. I made mistakes. I learned the ugly regimes of property taxes and the peculiar, almost national, rituals of landlords watching for leaks and broken pipes. I learned to read contracts. I learned to speak to contractors without being intimidated. I learned that the world of small real estate was not glamorous, but it was steady, and it responded to care. I did not tell Roberto. I had no dramatic reason for secrecy. In fact, I had every reason to be transparent. But there had always been a tension when we spoke of money. He believed himself to be the natural steward of our resources, as if the right to manage what we owned was something earned through the ability to build spreadsheets and speak with banks. He respected my domestic competence, but questioned my financial instincts. In one of those petty recurring arguments, he once joked that I couldn't tell the difference between an APR and a mood ring. The punchline landed by design. The joke became a border. To avoid the argument, I learned the art of omission. It wasn't calculated malice. It was practicality layered on top of old dynamics. I wanted a place of my own that would not be judged by the same yardstick as our shared life. I wanted to know, in the small, stubborn way women know, that I could survive without anyone's permission. The portfolio grew, slowly. A condo, A row house bought at a time when the neighborhood was still rough around the edges. A duplex that needed paint and patience. Every rental check was folded into a separate account. I paid taxes. I kept receipts. The work was honest and quiet and mine. I had other pockets of autonomy. Books I read on my own. A small photography hobby that produced walls of black and white prints in my office. A friend group that had nothing to do with parent committees. But money felt different. Money felt like a language you could use to tell the future a different story. Even as I built that quiet financial base, the marriage was changing. Small fissures widened. I began to notice patterns. The late excuses, the small jabs about my opinions, the way compliments stopped appearing unless performed in front of other people. Roberto's mother, Donna Neusa, drifted into our lives with increasing demands. She had opinions about how I dressed and how I raised the children. She liked the house arranged in a certain way and made sure everyone knew it. I tried to keep peace. I'd grown up in a place where harmony was prized and outspoken. Friction was punished with cold shoulder and whispers at family gatherings. I feared escalations. So I toned myself down, folded my needs into checklists, and moved through the house like a quiet current that kept things functioning. On the surface, we maintained the rituals. Birthdays, anniversary dinners that became comfortable rituals of habit more than romance. On our 25th anniversary, we went to the same restaurant we always went to, ate the same dish, and watched the same band. Somewhere between the braised beef and the soft piano, I realized my smile at the table was more about obligation than joy. It felt like an assigned seat. There were moments of humiliation that cut sharp. I remember one anniversary, our 32nd birthday of vows, ironically the same number the universe would later use to knife me. We were at a small family gathering at a friend's house. I had spent weeks mending a dress that never fit quite right, choosing a gift that I thought would please him, practicing a toast that would sound graceful and warm. Roberto arrived late, campy, and spent most of the evening flirting with his phone. He laughed at my stories with the polite distance of someone answering questions at work. When I tried to pull him aside, he shrugged, as if I were a minor interruption in a more important program. The next morning he told me, in that flat tone of someone administering informational damage, that I needed to loosen up. The remark landed like a dismissal. I laughed because my laugh felt safer than the hurt. Inside, I catalogued that evening as one of many tiny erasures. It was easy to rationalize. I had children to tend. We had grown-up worries and aging parents. Life had the right to be messy, but the rationalizations piled up into a pattern, and patterns become the architecture of life. Unhappiness is rarely a single event. It is the accumulation of ignored notices. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to be rendered invisible in a seat you once owned, think of the first time someone interrupts your sentence and never stops. Think of all the sentences you start and then tuck away. That is where my anger brewed, slowly, like a pot of water that has been left near the stove too long. When I started to suspect there was someone else, it wasn't a sudden thunderbolt. It was a series of small tremors. A phone pickup that stilled when I entered the room. The soft scent of perfume that wasn't mine at the sleeve of his jacket. Money missing from small envelopes he kept in his wallet. For emergencies. He grew defensive when I asked harmless questions. He complained I was paranoid. "You're imagining things," he said one evening, the words slippery and familiar. There is a peculiar kind of violence in being gaslit by the person who shares your bed and your bills. The self-doubt wraps itself like fog, and you start to believe you are the problem. I fought that fog with quiet investigation, not in the way of espionage or theatrical traps. No secret cameras, no violent confessions staged in the dark. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, and the stubborn truth that I would not let doubt hollow me from the inside. I began to collect small facts like someone building a mosaic, receipts from restaurants I had never heard of, a hotel key from a chain he denied ever staying at, a flippant text he left on a shared tablet that he assumed I wouldn't read. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they formed a picture that would not be ignored. There was a night I remember clearly. The house was humid from a storm, the kind that makes the trees sigh against the windows. Roberto called, voice low, saying he had to work late. I made dinner and ate alone, the chicken drying out in its pan. At midnight he walked in, shirt smelling faintly of citrus soap and someone else's perfume, and said, "We need to talk. We did not go to bed that night. We spoke in short sentences that landed like stones. He was tired, he said. He had found companionship elsewhere. I could have fallen apart, called my mother, texted every friend. Instead, I reached for an odd sort of quiet I had been practicing for years. I asked him calmly whether the woman had any financial interest in my life. He gave a shrug. "It doesn't matter," he said. "She's not here to take your money." That should have been the end of the conversation. But the phrase sat with me, nonsensical and dismissive. Why did it matter to him to declare what she was not after? What had been unsaid between us for years suddenly swelled into a question that deserved an answer. I told him I would make some calls the next day. "Fine," he said, as if the decision belonged to him to grant me permission to react. I called a friend, Beatrice, late that night. Beatrice and I had met at an art opening years before and solidified a friendship over long coffees and honest annoyances about marriage. "Don't do anything dramatic," she said without judgment, the voice that always kept me steady. "Document. Breathe. Get a lawyer if you need. But don't go hunting for proof alone." Her caution was sensible, but I was already moving in that careful, private way I had used to build my properties. The box that held my mother's jewelry sat on a high shelf in the attic. It felt symbolically right to pull it down. Inside, among the small trinkets and letters, I found a photograph of my mother with her arms around me at a market when I was a girl. Her eyes were fierce with pride. I pressed the photo to my chest and felt the stubborn pulse of lineage. Not only my mother's small inheritance, but a line of women who had improvised survival from what life gave them. The next morning I did not run to confrontation. I sat in my office and made a list. The list had headings, documents, accounts, people to call. I wrote down details I had already noticed, the dates and times of suspicious calls, the places he claimed to be. I found the key to one of the rental properties under the usual drawer, the one I kept for convenience for my contractor. A quick check of the online account for that property showed deposits. The separation between my life and our shared life had already been maintained on paper for years. It had not been a rebellion so much as an accumulation of choices. When I told Roberto I had spoken to the bank and the children's lawyers, if you call it that, the phone numbers of people you keep when you don't expect your life to fall apart, he flared. He asked why I was doing this. "Because," I said, "you told me you were leaving." He snapped a line about dignity, as if dignity is a club you can wield against someone balancing practicality on the table. I made a quiet, practical call to an attorney I had briefly met years earlier at a theater fundraiser. Her name was Dr. Henrique. No, that would be his name. My attorney was a woman, sharp and efficient, who had once joked that paperwork was her form of prayer. I left a message. I emailed our accountant. I set up a meeting with someone Beatrice recommended, a woman who'd made a career out of helping people rewrite lives after their marriages changed. People will read this and think it cold. They'll think of revenge and dramatic gestures. That's not what happened. What happened was that I refused to be erased without record. And there is dignity in paperwork when it is the only language left you have that everyone will acknowledge. Over the next days, I kept working through small, resolute tasks. I did not march into social media and declare war. I did not smear his name on public walls. I made calls, archived emails, and printed documents. I picked up a notary stamp I had tucked in a drawer for emergencies. I sat on my back porch at dawn with a cup of coffee and let the house wake up without sound. I practiced being still and being deliberate. The moment that would complicate everything arrived not with shouting, but with a manila envelope. A private investigator, a woman named Clara, that Beatrice had trusted like family, had been quietly working for a week. I had engaged her because the holes in my knowledge were becoming dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that you cannot act effectively without evidence. She had a steady manner, and the quiet of someone who had seen too much sadness to be dramatic about it. She called me and said, "I have something you should see." Sitting at my desk with the envelope on my lap, my hands trembled, not from shock, but from the sudden awareness that numbers and photos and words on paper had the power to change the course of the next months. Inside the envelope were photographs, simple, undeniable. A hotel keycard with dates that matched nights Roberto said he was working late. Receipts, screenshots of messages that kept affection and numbers tucked between the lines. There was a ledger, a careful list of transactions and hotels. There were photos of a woman I would later learn was named Juliana. She was 32 in the pictures, luminous, smiling in a way that made private rooms look like sunlight. She looked the part Roberto had described, young, untroubled, as if life had not yet made demands of her. I set the stack of papers down and closed my eyes. For a long while, I did not let myself go to images of Roberto and Juliana. Instead, I read the notes Clara had included in a plain, precise hand. Times, addresses, the dates of meetings. The records were a map of the small betrayals, the little economies that had been created behind my back. I felt something form in my chest that was not merely anger. It was a precise, cold clarity that traversed the ache. I thought of that photo of my mother, fierce and proud. I thought of the little properties that had been mine and secret, the years of doing without, for the sake of our family. The realization that hit me then was not that I had been abandoned, though that hurt in parts. The true sting was that for so many years, I had been living in a shape that fit someone else's idea of me. I had been living for the life we built together, our house, the roles, his needs, and in doing so, I'd folded away a version of myself that was not simply the other half of a marriage, but an entire person. For years I had thought my sacrifices were proof of love. Now I understood they were also windows I had left open for others to look through and rearrange. It was not only Roberto who had been shifting, I had been shrinking to make space for him. I realized who I'd been living for. I had been living partly for his comfort, partly for his image of me, partly to keep the peace with in-laws, and partly for an idea of marriage that rewarded surrender. The recognition landed with a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the years, and relief that the map was now clear. When Roberto phoned that evening to say he had chosen a date to leave, I put the envelope on the table between us. He skimmed the photographs, his face becoming a study in pale surprise, and then embarrassment. There was a flash, an old expression he used when things turned awkward, like a man trying to arrange his shirt as if the gesture could smooth the whole scene. "Where did you get these?" he asked, but he already knew. "From someone doing her job," I said. "She was thorough." He reached for the old line about privacy and dignity and betrayal. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. I listened. I had recorded his words elsewhere in my notebook. "I've been unhappy. I need to be myself. It isn't your fault." Words that felt both banal and explosive because you never imagine a person you shared a bed with will use them like a file drawer. I told him not to come near the house for a few days. It was a practical ask. I was careful to keep everything within legal boundaries, to respect the advice of the lawyer I had finally managed to speak with in a brief phone conversation. She had told me to secure what was mine and to document everything. She had recommended a preliminary freeze on any joint financial accounts if possible, until we clarified legal ownership. I did not execute that freeze myself. I set the wheels turning by telling my bank I was concerned about unusual activity and asked for an appointment. A friend advised discretion. Another friend advised boldness. I aimed for something between steady, lawful action that would create a record, an insurance policy, not a sword. That night I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I made a list of things I wanted to do that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. On it I wrote, in messy handwriting, finish the photography course, apply for an executive program I had once dreamed of, call the contractor about the fence at the duplex, schedule a mammogram, not because anyone asked, but because I wanted to keep myself well. The list felt like a map to a future self I had not met yet. It was small and audacious, and mine. Roberto's absence the next morning was a raw, clean thing. The house took on new acoustics. The fridge hummed like an appliance I had never noticed. The echo in the hallway seemed to mark time like an old clock. I walked from room to room and noticed marks in the wallpaper. The faded place where a picture had hung. The particular way the light fell on the stair where his shoes always sat. I did not break down. I did not gloat. I catalogued and moved forward. There are things that feel like betrayal and things that feel like redemption, sometimes along the same line. For me, after that first week with the envelope on my table, the revelation of who I had been living for became a hinge. It didn't erase the hurt, but it allowed me to step off a script that had been written when I was younger, when certain sacrifices felt noble. The realization that my life had been partitioned into helpful spaces and hidden rooms gave me something I had not expected. Options. But the options would not be easy. There were practicalities, meetings with lawyers, the risk of public humiliation, conversations with our children that I dreaded. There were choices about what to keep, what to fight for, and what to walk away from. There were the moral complications of wanting justice without indulging in cruelty. The road ahead was mapped partially by documents and partially by a stubborn insistence that the rest of my life would not be arranged by someone else without my consent. On the third day after the envelope arrived, Clara called to say she'd uncovered more. A lease payment with a name that matched Juliana's, payment for a small apartment close to the city, and the names of 2 bank accounts in institutions that had years ago been mutual, but now showed transfers that had no explanation. She asked if I wanted everything compiled into a formal dossier. I said yes. When the dossier arrived, larger now and more definitive, I opened it with a kind of ceremonial gravity. This was not entertainment. It was evidence. I placed it on the table, and for the first time in a long time, felt the coolness of decision slide into place like a key into a lock. My life, previously diffuse and full of soft edges, suddenly had contours again. I could see how to move, not out of anger, but out of a precise, lucid plan. That plan would require more than paper. It would require me to make uncomfortable phone calls, to explain to Gabriel and Amanda in a voice that did not panic, to balance the legal and the personal, to brace for battles I could not yet see. It would also require courage of a quieter sort, courage to reclaim parts of myself I had folded away, to choose deliberately the life I wanted to build beyond this rupture. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The street below was ordinary. A mail carrier rounding a corner, a man walking his dog, a couple arguing softly on a stoop. Life continued with its small, sharp edges. I put my palm on the cool glass and said under my breath, "I realize who I've been living for." It was not a sentence of accusation. It was a sentence of arrival. I felt it settle into my bones. I knew the months ahead would be long. I also knew for the first time in years that there were things I would do not because they preserved an image of family for someone else, but because they preserved me. That evening, as the sun slid behind the row of maples on our street, I heard the click of the front gate. The house shifted. Roberto came home. He carried a small suitcase and a boxed plant. He placed the plant in the hallway like a gift, as if our home could be softened with something green. He sat at the dining table and tried, once more, to negotiate the terms of a life he had already decided to leave. "I didn't want to take anything that wasn't mine," he said, eyes avoiding mine. "You know that. I thought you were better than this," I said. The words surprised us both by their tenderness. "But you are what you are." He looked as if I had slapped him. He stood, insistent, taking small aggressive steps as if the floor might tilt. "You could have told me," he said. "You could have asked for help. This secrecy—" "You could have asked for us," I replied. "You had a choice. So did I." The conversation could have been uglier. For a moment I felt the old self, the mother, the conciliator, rise, wanting to patch the hole in the sail. But the dossier sat on the table across from us, an unmoved witness. Instead of reaching for reconciliation or shame, I reached for a cup of tea. I drank it slowly, feeling the warmth like a permission to be steady. There was a pause. He was a man accustomed to having things go his way. That evening he realized things had begun to move past his control. He left before midnight and did not return for 2 nights. I did not call him. I did not beg. I spoke to Dr. Carmen, the lawyer, and scheduled an in-person meeting. I set an appointment with the bank to request a hold on certain joint spendings pending consultation. I told Beatrice to come over and bring soup. When she arrived, we sat at my kitchen table and ate with quiet honesty. "He looked like a man trying to shrink into a coat that didn't fit," she said eventually. "Beatrice has a gift for saying things that make you laugh and wince in one breath." She poured me more soup as if pouring courage into a cup. "You always had a life outside of him," she added in that comforting, precise way friends have. "You just forgot sometimes. It'll come back." "That's the point," I said. "I don't want to come back. I want something new." We talked until late, about property management companies and about a writing course I had been promising myself for years. We planned trips we might take together someday. Absurd, immediate plans like going to a small coastal town for a weekend where no one would know my story. Beatrice drew a rough map of what I might do in the coming year. A collage of small steps, a meeting with the lawyer, a photography show, a weekend away. The map wasn't revolutionary. It was practical and intimate. It was permission. At midnight when she left, the house hummed. I climbed the stairs and stood in the doorway of the bedroom we had shared for decades. The mattress still held the faint impression of 2 bodies, memories pressed like photographs into the fabric. I turned off the light and lay awake, cataloging the next steps like a surgeon considering an incision. There would be hearings, conversations with our children, attempts at mediation, choices about what to reveal and what to keep private. There would be days when I would wobble, and nights when I would be certain of nothing. But the dossier sat on my table. The photograph of Juliana glowed in the lamplight like an accusation and a signpost. I realized I was no longer living for the soft edges of marriage the way I had. I had been living for a conductor's baton I never held. Now, for better or worse, the baton was mine to take back. The next morning, Clara called to say she had tracked payment records to a small account registered under a company name that could be linked to Juliana. She suggested we meet to go through the dossier together before taking anything to the lawyer. "You should see everything in context," she said. "And there are people who will try to minimize this. Prepare." I agreed. Preparation felt like a small, obedient ritual. Call, meet, verify, document. There is dignity in method. There is also danger in method, because method turns feelings into evidence, and evidence into something that can be argued in a room full of strangers. As I waited that afternoon for Clara at my kitchen table, I looked at the list I had started. Courses, travels, small, stubborn acts of self-care. I underlined a line. Don't live for his image of you. The house clock ticked. The sun slanted through the blinds. There was a knock at the door. I opened it and found Clara standing there, weathered notebook in hand, professional in a way that made the moment feel like a scene from a novel where every ordinary thing becomes freighted with meaning. "Are you ready?" she asked. I sat down, pushed the dossier toward me, and felt the quiet truth settle in my chest like a design. I was ready enough. "I am," I said. Clara sat at my kitchen table as if she were entering a quiet cathedral. No loud proclamations, only careful movements. She opened her notebook and spread a new sheet of paper between two photographs, the corners of the images still warm from being handled. We went through everything together. Dates, times, cross-references to bank statements, hotel keys, messages. She had organized the material with the patience of someone who knows how fragile people's lives become when evidence is clumsily assembled. Her voice never betrayed pity. It carried instead the steady cadence of someone who had done this before and wanted the facts to speak, not the theater. "Keep a copy in a safe place," she advised, tapping the dossier's binder. "And another with your lawyer. If you ever need to ask a judge for something quick, you have to be the one who can show it." It wasn't dramatic. It didn't have to be. The files were dramatic enough. We made a plan. Clara would continue to gather anything she could find that was ethically obtained. I would meet with Dr. Carmen first thing in the morning. I would also call the bank and request an appointment. And I would tell Gabriel and Amanda what I had discovered in a way that was honest without being raw. That afternoon, I sat across from my lawyer in a compact office lined with books. Dr. Carmen, tall, in a neutral suit that somehow made her look both formidable and approachable, took in the dossier with quick, appraising eyes. She asked questions that were precise and unromantic. When did you acquire each asset? How was it purchased? Where are the receipts? Are there any joint signatures on accounts? Were any of these properties paid for from marital funds? Do you have documentation of your mother's inheritance? I handed her the paper copies with a calm that made my hands steady, even when my stomach wanted to rearrange itself into knots. There was comfort in the way she flipped through pages, in the way her pen hovered only briefly before annotation. "You've done thoughtful, methodical work," she said finally. "This is a good start. The law will look for evidence that certain assets are separate property and not marital property. Your mother's bequest, if it was kept separate and accounted for, will be an important piece." There were legal terms I hadn't meant to learn that morning. Commingling, equitable distribution, temporary restraining orders, but Carmen translated them into plain sentences. She didn't make promises. She offered pathways. We discussed putting certain accounts on alert and sending a formal notice to Roberto's counsel about our concerns regarding access to joint accounts. She recommended we ask the bank to flag transactions and to delay any transfers out of accounts that had been used in ways I could not account for. When I left her office, the sun was already softening. I called the bank and with a polite firmness that kept my voice steady, I asked to speak to someone about unusual activity and the possibility of monitoring our joint accounts pending further legal clarification. The bank representative listened, asked for some documentation, and agreed to a temporary watch. It was not a freeze. That would have to come through a court order. It was, however, a line of defense. I felt slightly less exposed. Telling Gabriel and Amanda felt like stepping into a room where the air had a particular charge. They came quickly, both of them as if their adult lives could not be contained in the time it takes to get to their parents' house. Gabriel sat down first, his face a map of careful concern. Amanda hovered near the doorway, a half-formed reaction caught between joining and holding back. I could have hidden the dossier, pretended I was somehow coping alone. I did not. I placed the folder on the table between us and explained calmly what Clara had compiled. I told them the facts and the steps I had taken. I told them about my properties, about the inheritance their grandmother had left, about the way I had kept some things separate because it felt like an insurance policy, not an act of secrecy. There were moments of stuttering disbelief. "Why didn't you tell us?" Amanda asked. Her voice had the sharpened edge of someone hurt by omission. Gabriel's response was quieter. "You should have said something, Mom. You shouldn't have had to fight this alone." Both of them had the right to be angry. They had also, in their different ways, been allowed to be children of a marriage that dulled sometimes around the edges. "I thought I was protecting you," I said. "But I also thought I was protecting myself. I didn't want you to worry about us. I didn't want to create more friction. I can see now that was a mistake." Gabriel reached out and took my hand. "We're with you," he said. "Whatever you decide." Their support was not a shield against the pain, but it was a ballast. It reminded me that my life no longer needed to be a performance for the faint applause of others. It could be a work under construction, messy and hopeful. The first hearing was scheduled within weeks. Courtrooms have a particular smell, a mix of polished wood and old paper, undercut by the faint tang of the coffee vending machine in the lobby. There is a rhythm to the place, a formal shuffle of papers, the soft clack of shoes on tile, the hushed authority of clerks calling names. My palms sweated as I walked in, but my steps were intentional. I had a folder with copies of deeds, receipt books, rental ledgers, and Clara's reports. There was no stagecraft. There was only quiet preparedness. Opposite me sat Roberto's lawyer, a man who liked to speak in the double-handed language of negotiation. He raised his eyebrows when he saw the breadth of the dossier. His posture said he had not expected such a catalog defense. We presented our request to have certain accounts monitored and to acknowledge the separate property claim related to the inheritance and the specific properties purchased from it. The judge, a woman with the sort of calm that comes from years of seeing similar dramas, listened as Dr. Carmen laid out the facts. "Your Honor," she said, "we are asking for limited temporary relief to prevent the dissipation of assets that are clearly documented as separate property. The plaintiff," she glanced at me and then back at the bench, "has presented evidence indicating that these assets were acquired from funds traceable to an estate bequest and maintained separately and taxed accordingly. We request an order to prevent transfers pending further discovery." There was an exchange of legal pleasantries. Roberto's counsel argued that the accounts were marital and that any restrictive order would be premature. The judge read the documents with the careful attention of someone who must balance the letter of the law with the human consequences of a hasty order. She asked questions about the dates of purchase, about tax returns, about the way funds had been kept previously. Carmen answered succinctly. At the end of the hearing, the judge issued a temporary order. Accounts would be monitored and certain transfers would be subject to review. A full evidentiary hearing would be scheduled. It was not a verdict, but it was a protection. I felt my shoulders unclench by a fraction. There was gratitude in the movement, private and understated. That night, alone in the kitchen, I allowed myself a small celebration. I made a pot of tea and sat at the table with a slice of the lemon cake Beatrice had left earlier. The house seemed, for the first time in weeks, to be a place where decisions were not waiting to be made by someone else. I did not dance or shout. I simply let the warmth of the cup travel down my throat and felt a seed of relief take root. But legal processes are not tidy arcs. They are long nerve wires stretched between hearings, each one susceptible to fatigue and strategic maneuvering. Roberto's counsel employed delay tactics and suggested mediation. We agreed to mediation in the spirit of efficiency, and with Carmen's careful caveat: nothing would be finalized without documentation. In the private room where the mediator sat, there is always the peculiar tension of forced civility. People move through scripts they have rehearsed at home at 1 a.m., with different intonations. Roberto tried to be conciliatory. He tried to admit regret and confusion. He asked in a voice that wanted a sympathetic audience whether there wasn't a way to reframe the narrative so no one had to appear monstrous. I listened until I was bored, and then bored was disciplined into something useful. Boredom allowed me to see the performance for what it was: a man attempting to negotiate for softness without acknowledging the precise harms done. I kept an eye on the messenger bags on the floor, his lawyer's cues to when a concession might be acceptable. I refused to be seduced by comfortable language. We reached an interim agreement that allowed both sides to review the documents and to postpone the most contentious decisions until the evidentiary hearing. It was imperfect. It was also pragmatic. Carmen and I both believed that the documents, once fully aired in the right forum, would give me the stronger line. In the months that followed, life divided itself into two parallel tracks: the legal march and the private work of healing. The legal track was paper and hearings and the slow churn of bureaucracy. The private track was therapy and classes and the resumption of passions I had set aside. Therapy came later than it should have. I had a stubborn belief that pain could be organized into checklists. When the checklist failed, I had to admit I needed help with the messy interior mess. I found Dr. Elena through a friend's recommendation, someone who worked with women rebuilding after divorce and loss. She had a gentle habit of listening until the silence between sentences became an active presence. "Tell me about what happened," she prompted on our first session. I told her what I could. I told her the facts, dates, the envelope, the dossier, because facts felt safe. When she asked about how I had felt during my marriage, I surprised myself by stumbling into the old pattern of justification. I recited the calendar of sacrifices as if listing them would make them legitimate. She interrupted me with a single sentence that landed its weight like a hand on a table. "When did you stop choosing yourself?" It is an exquisitely simple question, and a difficult one to hear. I did not have an immediate answer. I had given things up as a mother gives up sleep, as a partner gives up certain private ambitions. These were gifts once. Over time, they had become default settings, an autopilot that I had not reprogrammed. In therapy, I learned the slow practices of reclaiming agency. She gave me small exercises to name one thing I would do every week that was not for anyone else, to star in a blank calendar square, a private appointment with myself, and keep it like a meeting with a very important client. The first week it was a photography class. The second week it was a routine mammogram I scheduled and attended on my own terms. Each small act was a stitch in the fabric of a new life. I also started to attend a local executive program I had applied to, in a fit of audacity one morning when the house was quiet. The acceptance letter felt like a small, combustible gift, a place where my mind could be stretched not by domestic questions, but by strategy and leadership. The MBA classes were mostly younger than I had expected, a mix of mid-career professionals and ambitious 20-somethings. My first class was strategy, and the professor, a brisk woman named Dr. Mitchell, started with an exercise that forced us to introduce ourselves and say what we wanted to get from the program. When my turn came, I said simply, "I want to build something that lasts." It sounded trite in my head, but when words leave your mouth and land in a room where possible futures are being imagined, they take on a new energy. From that first day, I found that reading case studies and debating market entry strategies woke a part of my brain that had been mostly idle. The classroom became a dangerous and delicious place. I wrote papers on customer retention. I learned Excel functions I had avoided for years. I sat in group projects and found that my decades of household logistics translated well into operations planning. People respected someone who had actually managed multiple properties and tenants. My anecdotes about leaky roofs and last-minute contractor negotiations elicited nods in a way I had not known to expect. In a seminar on negotiation, I listened and thought about the different ways people hold on to narratives about themselves. Learning strategy felt like sharpening a tool I had always carried, but left blunt. Business contacts followed the classroom. I met a woman, Claire, who ran a small property management firm. She liked my meticulous archival of receipts and offered me a consulting gig helping small landlords digitalize their records. It was not a glamorous job, but the work was mine and remunerated. I began to imagine scaling a small property management company, one that understood the dignity of tenants and the rights of owners, that treated property maintenance as both craft and public good. The financial independence I had quietly fostered became not only a legal fact, but a platform for creative work. The duplex that had once felt like a fixer-upper became the seed of a small business. I rebranded with care. My photography work supplied the website visuals. The writing of my own tenant handbook supplied the voice. It all felt integrated in a way I had not anticipated. Friends rallied. Beatrice organized a small show of my black and white photographs in a snug gallery downtown. The opening was small. Wine, a few neighbors, and people who liked art, but did not judge social life. I hung prints of silent streets, laundromats, a portrait of a woman at a market I had taken years ago. The images felt like the secret part of me put on display, and people responded kindly. Someone bought a print. A curator asked to include a piece in a community exhibit. Travel came thereafter not as an escape, but as a curriculum. I had imagined trips before, as if travel were a reward. Now travel was a classroom in living my renewed life. I went to Lisbon with Beatrice. Narrow streets, tiles glinting like scales, fado wafting from a cafe at midnight. We walked until our shoes were sore and ate fish that tasted of the sea and freedom. In Barcelona, I stole afternoons for photography, sunlight slicing across Gaudí's shapes, and I marveled at the audacity of color. In Paris, I stood in front of a small museum with a steam of rain and felt that my life could be gentle and full. Each trip taught me a practice, to be curious without performance, to abstain from filling silence with explanations, to let another city be the context instead of a person. Smallness felt tender. The world felt large enough to hold my small experiments. The months of legal process culminated in a final evidentiary hearing. It was in many ways an anticlimax. No dramatic confrontations, no explosive reveals. The judge sat at a bench she had occupied for years, and both sides presented their cases. Clara testified with the same steady precision she showed when we first met. She described what she had found and how she had obtained the information through legal means. Carmen pointed to tax returns and receipts and showed, in a way that felt both dull and decisive, the paper trail that traced purchases to my mother's estate. Roberto's counsel argued that the ring of marital life had involved both of us, and that certain commingled transfers had occurred. In the end, the judge made a ruling that, while not covering every conceivable outcome for every person who watches this story, gave me what I needed to move forward. The decision recognized the provenance of several properties as separate and ordered protection for those assets. There were concessions on both sides. Some shared holdings would be partitioned over time, and the judge suggested mediation for certain items. The ruling did not feel like triumphalism. It felt like the legal system acknowledging a fact that had been carefully documented. When the decision was read, I felt a weight lift, a practical relief more than a moral victory. I looked at Roberto in the courtroom. He looked thinner, like someone whose appetite for certainty had been partly eaten away. I did not gloat. There was no pleasure in punitive triumph. Instead, I felt a steady resolve that had been consolidated by papers and testimony, and the quiet presence of people who had done their jobs honestly. After the hearing, life loosened its taut strings in small ways. The bank released certain watches. I returned to the office with renewed energy, and the duplex began receiving consistent rent with fewer maintenance headaches. I paid Clara for her work and felt gratitude for the professionalism she brought into such an intimate rupture. I thanked Carmen in person and noticed the small softening in her features that comes from having shepherded someone through an ordeal. The real change, though, was less legal and more internal. Therapy had begun to bear fruit. In one session, Dr. Elena asked me to write a letter to my younger self. Me at 22, in love, hopeful. I wrote about the small, useful things I had learned. How to patch a wall, how to bargain with contractors, how to plan a child's birthday. Then I wrote about the lessons I wished I had learned earlier. How to name my needs without apology, how to maintain friendships when life demands domestic labor, how to tend to my own ambitions often and early. When I read the letter aloud in the therapist's office, my voice cracked and then steadied. "You were trying to survive," she said, "and you did. Now you have to learn to thrive." Thriving took forms I hadn't anticipated. It meant a late-night pitch to a small group of investors about a property management app I wanted to build. It meant scheduling regular dates with myself to do nothing but wander with a camera. It meant saying no to an invitation because the evening was better spent sleeping. It also meant opening to companionship without making it a requirement for happiness. Michael came into my life in the softest of ways, at a friend's dinner party where conversations meandered from books to weather to photography. He was not young. He was not flashy. He had a steady laugh and the sort of hands that looked as if they had done practical work in the world. He liked black coffee and disliked small talk. We met in the garden and compared stories about our mothers. He listened when I spoke about my recent exhibition and asked questions that were curious rather than invasive. We dated slowly. That is the honest line. There was no whirlwind, only the accumulation of small moments. A walk through a winter market, a shared boat ride on the river, a long talk about how we both had been wronged by circumstance at different times. He never asked me to move faster than I wanted. He was respectful to my children, and liked Beatrice without trying to compete with her humor. Romance in my 50s felt less like discovery, and more like the pleasant extension of a life that had found some footing. It did not replace the life I had lost. It complemented the life I was building. Michael became a partner in the limited sense of companionship. Someone to travel with who asked nothing from me that would diminish my autonomy. There were hard afternoons, too. Some nights the house felt raw with memory. A song would come on the radio, and I would be momentarily undone. I learned to let the feelings come and leave rather than knotting them inside until they choked future joy. I also learned to use ritual, a walk at dusk, a phone call to a friend who knows how to hold the space without offering pat answers. The process of repair was less cinematic and more domestic. Laundry, therapy, meetings, small acts of kindness to myself. As the years slid forward, the portfolio stabilized. I hired a manager and then a small team, people who were competent and kind. The business took on a life of its own, a modest thing that paid employees fairly and focused on tenant dignity. I taught a workshop on tenant relations at the local community college, and was surprised by how much joy I felt in passing on practical knowledge. The students had questions about security deposits and about maintaining roofs in winter. I answered and found myself animated by the technicalities and human stories alike. My children settled differently into the new normal. Gabriel had been through a divorce himself and had practical counsel. Amanda moved cities and sent postcards. There were dinners, awkward sometimes, gentle often, where we spoke of smaller things and also of what had happened. We did not repair everything overnight, but the cracks that remained were crossed by honest conversations. They came by not to fix me, but to be with me, as adults who had their own lives. Occasionally I saw Juliana's name in the dossier documents I still kept. Sometimes I would glance at a message archived in a folder and feel the old skitter of irritation. But over time, the feeling shifted. Her existence, once a flaring wound, grew into a thin scar I could touch without pain. When I allowed compassion to enter, it was a small, private thing. Young people make choices that reverberate. Some of those choices are reckless, some are innocent, and most are complicated. I did not indulge in revenge. I did not humiliate Roberto in public. There was no need. The facts of our lives had done the work of clarity. Where there had been humiliation, there was now accountability. Where there had been erasure, there was now record and the slow, steady work of rebuilding. Years later, walking through the duplex with my manager checking contracts and the paint color on a sunny morning, I thought back to the first smile I had given Roberto the night he told me about Juliana. That small smile, so controlled, had been the hinge point. It had been the moment when something inside me, acetylated by long practice, shifted from automatic sacrifice to deliberate choice. I had begun to live for different reasons, for curiosity, for dignity, for the lineage of women in my family who had told themselves quietly to get up and do it again. I had been living for many things, for my children, for the maintenance of a household, for the fragile peace in a marriage that sometimes depended on silence. I had also been living for someone's comfort and his idea of how our life should look. Learning that changed me. The discovery did not erase the tenderness I had for the life we built together. It simply expanded the circle of what I considered sacred to include myself. If you have been through something similar, hear this. There is no single map. I was fortunate to have a quiet financial buffer and the resources to hire counsel. Not everyone will have that. The most important tool I had was persistence, the unwillingness to let confusion eat away at me. I documented. I sought counsel. I took care of my body and mind. I built new networks. Those are not guarantees. They are practices that may help you move through a season of unmooring. There were pragmatic lessons too. Keep records of what is yours. Know where accounts are held. Talk to a lawyer early if you suspect financial irregularities. Surround yourself with people who respect your autonomy. None of that is a magic formula. It is simply the practice of making choices that keep your life from being decided by others. Now, on a morning when the kettle whistles and the sunlight paints the floorboards, I have a routine that is unapologetically mine. I take my coffee black, read from a book that is not for anyone else, and plan the week. I have new friends, a business I am proud of, photographs that hang in places beyond my living room, and a man who listens without consuming me. My life is not perfect. It is, however, chosen. Once it had felt as if my life were a set of rooms I had furnished to please someone else. Now the rooms are still there, but I have rearranged the furniture according to my taste and needs. I host dinners, yes, and I also keep a shelf of books no one has asked me to read. I travel, I study, I work. I am not defined solely by loss. I am defined by the way I choose to use the days I have. The phrase that began this, after 32 years of marriage, he left for someone younger, still holds its weight. It is the truth that launched me into change, but the rest of the sentence, that I realized who I had been living for, was the revelation that followed. It wasn't merely the staying of record or the legal victory that made the difference. It was the hard, marvelous work of remembering myself and then acting on that remembrance. If this story lands on your shoulders in a way that feels heavy, know that small acts matter. Start with one thing this week that is for you and only you. If the story brings you courage, share it with someone who might need to hear that second chances are not only for the young and dramatic. They exist for people who choose them slowly and insistently. If this has touched you, share it with a friend who needs encouragement. Subscribe if you want more honest stories of reinvention and dignity. Thank you for listening to mine.